street, and the camera is with him. Well, not with him, but is him. Right. Yeah. Okay, here we are. Ready, yeah. Oh, here we are, ready to go. Time for the final exam. Time for all of us to pack up and go home when we're done. And so let's get started, see what's on the final exam. So this is the final exam review. And the first thing is it starts Thursday. And, you know, it's going to be the same kind of procedure, the same process as you had with the midterms. So it starts Thursday and it runs one full week. It'll run through December 7th, again in the testing center. And it does, I do know this because it happens every final exam period. The exam closes on Thursday and it closes early. So you don't have the luxury of kind of looking at a late night if you're going to wait till the last minute, because it will be the 11th hour. So it's like it closes like at 5 o'clock on Thursday. So make sure and just think, take your exam ahead of time. All right. There'll be no makeup exams when final exam time comes. Sorry, folks, that's the way it goes. So make sure and check for Saturday hours, because that's always, for me, it seems to be, at least students have told me, is the best time to get in there during Saturday, because you can just about go in at any time during their hours. And okay, it's just like before. It's going to be an objective exam, 50 questions again, although it covers everything from our previous time to the end. It doesn't go back. The study guides are now available on Moodle, and if you have not downloaded it, be sure to download it, because I think you're going to like this study guide. And all I can say to you is Merry Christmas and you're welcome. Okay. It will be, again, in the Instructional Testing Services office, the center over there, the center building, just where you were before. And remember, I just have to remind you of all of these things. It's the same thing. You've already gone through the process. You know it. But make sure you have the photo ID. You are allowed one 3x5 note card again. And be sure and check and verify the hours. Don't get locked out. That's not good. And follow the center's rules and requirements. If they tell you to take your hat off, take your hat off. Okay. Extra credit. Okay. Now, for those people that are doing extra credit, it is due December 5th. That is a week from tomorrow. In my office, you can just, if you have a hard copy or whatever, you can hand it to me, but most people now are just sending it as attachments to the email, and that's good. That works best, so do it that way. Nobody for the last like 5, 6, 7 years, I can't remember the last time that somebody sent me something in the mail. So that's very rare, but I just offer it just in case somebody is still typing on a typewriter and sending it as a manuscript in the mail. Okay, so what is on the exam this time around? All right, it's going to start with the combat film, and then it's going to go through what is going on this week, the Edge of Hollywood and the film school generation. That was last week. It's the Edge of Hollywood, and also we'll cover film noir and film in the television age, and we'll get to that specifically right now. So the first thing we look at is what's the important thing about the combat war film. Again, everybody else calls it a war film. They like to call it the combat film. The features of the genre. Okay, laws and morality get suspended. So when you're out there fighting a war, there are no rules. Even though there's supposed to be rules of war, it's every man for himself. There is a switch now, and you can see this very much so in the difference between the combat film and the Western. Because in the combat film, and again, the reason why we mention that is because there's a pivotal figure, a pivotal icon that represents both of these, the Western and the combat film, and that was John Wayne. And so that's why we say here that there is a switch from the individual, which is what we find in the Western, now to the group, and especially if we have to identify that group is the troops. And then thirdly, we have women as emotional element that brings out male vulnerability. I remember, it's kind of an interesting thing, it is that the presence of a female in these films in particular, they serve as sort of almost a spiritual thing in which what they bring out of all of these killers, these men that are out there killing each other, it brings out a sense of humanity in them. And that is very much presented in that John Wayne film called The Sands of Iwo Jima. But it works that way. And I can remember when I was working on a book, I wrote a big, long, involved article, co-wrote it, article on Jack Webb as a filmmaker and as his TV show Dragnet. And I remember this little factoid thing when he was doing that show called Adam 12, and the voice that came over the radio was a female voice, you know, that would send the police off to an assignment. And he was a stickler, of course, for authenticity. And so he had this woman who was the voice of the radio. He hired her as an actress to read all of these lines. But what I found out was one of the reasons why it was a woman was because the psychologist at that time, the psychologist told the Los Angeles Police Department to hire females, women, to run the radio, because at that time the police officers were all men, and it was a calming influence on them. It was the fact that if the cops were under fire and they would radio for help and the woman came back on, there was a sense of relief or something. There was a sense of security, almost like mommy or something, that was coming through on that. So I thought, so it's that same kind of principle here that what happens in these war films. Moving on, in the combat film, they talked about the anti-war sentiments in post-war films. During the war, it is all for the cause. It is rally round the flag, boys. But in war, there's awful things that go on, and people die. And after the war, instead of rally round the flag, boys, some of the filmmakers begin to look at those things and make films that deal with the reality of it all. And it was, well, we could go on. I could lecture on that forever about those post-war films. Got to move on. War films and portrayal of racial integration of the armed forces. Those also came to the fore in the late 40s. The Men being one of them. Stanley Kramer made a film about integration. And moving on, the fundamental American philosophy or ideology embedded in the American war film is this: we may not always win physically, but we are always right ideologically. So in those films, the whole purpose is we are right, and that because we are right, might makes right. Now, also part of that, they discussed the Office of War Information, and it's the role of the U.S. government in Hollywood film production. And it was quite simply propaganda. And its purpose was shaping public opinion. And many of the great filmmakers of the time were part of the service. They enlisted like everybody else. The government could see the power that they have as storytellers and put them into a position where they could make training films, they could make propaganda films, and so forth. We always talk about that. One of the filmmakers was John Huston, and he made a film called The Battle of San Pietro, and that film was censored during the war. It was not shown until afterwards, and primarily the reason it was censored was because it was an unblinding eye to combat. He and his cameraman were in the middle of combat, and they captured what was going on, and you saw men die, and you couldn't have that during the war. So the film was held up until after the war. It is a very powerful film. It's a short subject. It only runs about 20 minutes, 30 minutes, but it's a very powerful movie, and it's pretty much a kind of a precursor to the cinema verite type of documentary, which is no narration. You just sort of present reality as it is and just capture it. And it is a very powerful film. There is also the Sergeant York formula, depicting the conversion of an objector to supporter. And this gambit was used all the way in 1968. It was the same formula that was used in John Wayne's film called The Green Berets. Okay, moving on to film noir. Okay, film noir, everybody's favorite type of movie, which actually means black film. A French word that means black film. And what we say about it is that Americans made noir, but the French discovered it. They made a certain kind of film, a post-war film. And essentially that's what it is, although many argue that the first film noir was The Maltese Falcon. Yes, it has some things in it. You could even probably go back even to some silent era films to it. But as a movement as such, as what the French discovered was post-war. And that's primarily because in the way that the women are depicted, which we'll talk about in a moment. And they wrote about it in that journal called the Cahiers du Cinéma. This was a post-war production publication, that is, by the French, by these French critics who all of a sudden now the war is over and they get to see American films again. The Nazis are gone, and so American films show up and they begin to look at these wonderful films that Americans have made, including the what they now describe as film noir, these interesting films, which we continue with. It emerged, as I just said, in the 1940s as a reflection of social malaise and economic uncertainty resulting from World War II. It's kind of an interesting thing historically to look at that, and you find, oh my gosh, we're right in the middle of a war. It's a terrible war. We haven't seen carnage like this ever. I mean, World War II makes World War I look like a practice, looks like Little League. And we're seeing all of this horrible death and destruction, and a lot of it by machines, by giant machines built by mad scientists almost, built by science that create these machines. And the ultimate weapon is used at this time, the atom bomb. And we're going, what have we done? So the war is over, so everybody should be happy. They are happy, the war is over. But now what do you do? Now what do you do? Our economy, what was driving the economy? The war machine. The war is over. Now what's going to do it? So there's all this uncertainty that comes with it. Now it's not as if, and don't get me wrong, it's not as if you drop the atomic bomb, everybody signs peace, it's over, and now everybody walks out and say, what do we do now? No, it's a slow process, and it's usually we don't know what's going on until it's already happened, and we look back on it and say, that's what was going on. So what we're seeing here is a lot of this popular art at the time is reflecting our uncertainty. Considered a film movement extending from the early 1940s to the late 1950s. The crime films of this period are noticeably different. They are different in theme and style, and especially mood, from those made before or after. And it, as I mentioned, it's considered the first one is The Maltese Falcon, and it ends in 1958 with Orson Welles' Touch of Evil. That seems to be where everybody draws the line. Have there been film noir, movies made since then? Probably, but not to the extent that we could say and catalog them in with the same bunch of films that were made primarily in the 1950s. Chinatown, Polanski's Chinatown, or is that right? Is it Roman Polanski? Yeah. Chinatown, they always called it a film noir. I don't know. To me, it doesn't have the same flavor as film noir. There are parts of it you can probably argue, a real, true cinematic guy that says, I am going to make this as a film noir. I've got a storyline. I know how I want to do it. They would really fight. And if you had the clout, like Polanski did at that time, you'd fight it and say, I'm going all black and white because it's the only way I can create this world, because part of what made film noir what it is black and white. There was no gray, as well, you could argue that, but pretty much what it was is pretty much a black and white world with, and you're living in the black side of that world. The white side of that world, where there is some kind of light or whatever, is far away. You just have to exist in the darkness. Okay, what are the settings? This is the thing that really we like about it. It's really a lot of what film noir, we owe it to the photographers. But the settings are very much urban. There are rain-slicked streets, and it's always set in the sleazy side of city life. It's down there in Skid Row. It's down there in the unfavorable side of town. It's not something that you just love to go down there. It's where the dives are. It's where everything is cheap. It's cheap liquor, cheap people. You buy and sell people. It's just a horrible place to be. And the themes, alienation. My gosh, everybody is alienated. And certainly existentialism permeates throughout these films. There's just no exit. You'll never get out of it. Even if the detective wins in the end, big deal. Okay, for a brief moment, he has solved the crime, but it doesn't do anything. It doesn't change his life. Nothing happens. He's still going to be there in that dark side of the town. The character types that we encounter are the amnesiacs, people that can't remember what's going on. If you see a movie like Black Angel, the whole set piece there is that the main character can't remember anything. He's too drunk. And he just doesn't remember what happened. His wife is murdered. He doesn't even remember he was married. And so he sets out to find out who kills her. They are antisocial loners. That's all they are. They walk the streets by themselves. If they have a friend, there's only one friend. Often, as you can pretty well guess, because if you are a film noir fanatic, you've also listened to radio programs that have this theme behind it. You've also seen television shows, and you know that the only friend that this guy has is usually a drunk. Usually some guy that's more drunk than sober. And it's his only companion. Assertive women, that is the part that really pushed film noir to the fore. That is what the French discovered, is that women were now assertive. There are no more school marms. You know, it is now women are tough, and nowhere is that can be better seen than in that movie Detour. It's a movie, runs for an hour. It's made by a cheap studio known as PRC, and it is a dynamo of film noir. And that woman, played by Anne Savage, in that woman, boy, does she absolutely controls our antisocial loner guy. And watch it. It's a public domain movie. It's everywhere. It fell into the public domain. And you can find it on YouTube. You can find it probably for, 50 cents at some discount video place, because it's everywhere. And it only runs an hour, but it is dynamic. And of course, private detectives. We already knew that. That's, if we do the Maltese Falcon, where it begins, the private detective, of course, is Sam Spade. And moving on, the film style. This is what we like about it. The film style. We have low-key lighting. We have shadowy elements. This is what I always enjoy about it. What I always love about looking at a film noir is some of the great directors play with the shadows. Wells is one of the major people that will play with shadows. But I always think of Robert Siodmak is one of the top directors of film noir. And he'll just run shadow across a person's face in a dialogue sequence, and all you see is the guy's lips. when they're talking back and forth because the shadow covers everything else. Or it might be you see this guy's lips, you cut, it's a back and forth shot, and you cut to the other guy and all you see is his eyes. It's just the shadow elements are crazy. And that's also what you get there with strange highlights. That's what I mean by that. They're highlighting the guy's mouth, or they're highlighting half his face, they're highlighting something in there. And it's disorienting to see this. And of course, extreme camera angles, high and low distortion. Now, that brings us, I'll come back to that in a minute because we got to talk about the production code in film noir, because film noir really did push the limits. Film noir often alluded to prohibited subjects without directly violating the production code. And it did. Pushed it to the extreme. And they got away with a lot. And then the gender issues there, assertive if not aggressive females, and the women are femme fatales. And I can't remember who came up with this theory, but a lot of or one of the theories which caught on about this is that perhaps the film noir was a result of women, Rosie the Riveter, that the men were gone, the women had to run the factories, the women now have jobs, they like their jobs, they're working in the factories, the war is over, the men come back, and the men want their jobs back. And the women are saying, oh yeah? That's my job. And there's assertiveness there. And so this kind of thing, this sex roles get all turned upside down because after all, come on, Martha, you're supposed to be at home doing the dishes. You're supposed to be cleaning the house. You're not supposed to be making a car. I'm supposed to be making a car. And Martha says, I can do both. At this point, she says, I'll make the car and I'll go home and clean the house. Or better yet, I'll make the car, you go home and clean the house. Okay. Now, I wanted to say that, go back to what we were talking about, all of those elements that we were talking about, the shadowy effects and everything, because the question that comes to mind is this: is film noir a film genre? The same that we talk about horror movies, same that we talk about westerns, all of that stuff. Is film noir a genre that we can prescribe, we can talk about, we can look at all the iconography, we can look at all that stuff and come out and say, yeah, it is a film genre? Or is it a mode of filmmaking in the sense that we got all these people who are just making these cool looking films? All the photographers are going nuts and just saying they're throwing shadows this way, that way, and all of that. Or is it a general sensibility? And when we talked about those things out there, all of those shadowy elements and the low-key lighting, the angles that are off, all of that kind of stuff, what we just described there, if you've seen the film, what we have just described is Citizen Kane. And yet nobody would ever argue that Citizen Kane is film noir per se. They would argue it has a film noir style, because when we talk about, my favorite in Citizen Kane about that, when you talk about shadowy elements, is Thompson, the reporter. We never, ever see his face, that we could recognize the guy. He's always in a shadow, always, all the way through this movie. The guy who is reporting on this guy Kane, and yet we've never seen his face. He's always covered in shadow. And we also have disorientation there. One of my favorite scenes in that film is when Kane is looking at his opponent, the politicians, Jim W. Geddes, who's out there, Jim W. Geddes, and he's standing in front of this big auditorium, and it's a matte shot, and it looks like Kane is about 10 miles above him in this auditorium, and it is an exaggerated scene. And but of course, I could go on forever on that, and we're almost out of time, and I barely got anywhere. It is a general sensibility, is my feeling. You just sense a film noir. You just know when you're in the presence of film noir. It feels good. You just sit there in a theater, and up pops the credits, and behind the credits is this rain-slick place, the city center, and you're going, oh boy, I think we're going to be here in the middle of it. Okay, moving on. Film noir is a social commentary on post-war reality. It is also modern mass American culture, consumerism, and disillusionment with Paradise Lost. It's kind of the opposite of what we have with the Western. Now, moving on, because we got to talk about film and television age. The post-war decline in attendance, that is very true. One of the crazy things about our film history is that in 1946, more people went to the movies than at any other time in the history of movies. And that even is today, all right? Because you adjust for inflation, you do all that kind of stuff. Still, in 1946. In 1947, fewer people went to the movies than ever. And it dropped off. And what was the threat? Well, the threat was not just television. That's what we like to blame it on. But it wasn't the only culprit. As our series talks about, there was more leisure time. There was more money. There were interest in other activities, and there was a sudden migration to the suburbs. And the other activity, the most popular leisure activity at this time, bowling. And the agreements between the motion picture industry and TV, they hated each other. Movies did not want to embrace it. As a matter of fact, in the beginning, TV is clear over here in New York. Movies remain in Hollywood. And even if they would forbid their actors to appear, Hollywood forbid their actors to appear in TV shows. The TV becomes, of anything, a subsidiary market for motion pictures. The movie industry responds to television and declining audiences through technical innovations. This is what happens. The first thing is three-dimension, coming at you, 3D movies. Then it becomes horizon-spanning widescreen. And then they add the element of stereophonic sound to it all. So the first thing is 3D. Movies are coming at you. You wear those little glasses to see things that just jump into your lap. Then it's Cinerama. Actually, Cinerama starts before 3D, but it doesn't catch on right away. But you get Cinerama. This is that giant curved screen. So you sit in a theater and you can see things out of the corner of your eye. It's peripheral vision. And it works with 3 cameras. And then CinemaScope comes along. The poor man's Cinerama. Fox develops it. It is a widescreen experience. That's how it works. It's known as anamorphism. It is an anamorphic squeeze. It's a lens that squeezes a wide image onto the film strip. And then when you play it in a theater, you have a compensating lens that squeezes it back out, and you get that wide screen. It is developed by Panavision into something that is technically superior to CinemaScope, primarily through the lenses made by a man named Gottschalk, first done in a movie. That's all this movie was made for, that movie, Dangerous Charter. The only reason it was made was to promote Panavision, so that all the studios would like it. And I know that because my good friend Wright King appeared in that movie. And the technical modifications know this, the panning and scanning and letterboxing. When they were shot in CinemaScope for TV, they used to pan and scan it, which destroyed the artistic efforts of any director. And then they created the letterbox. And then you have also the independent producers. They discovered the teenage market. And what you have in the 50s primarily is the low-budget exploitation movies and pushing monsters and teenagers, which are often interchangeable, such as I Was a Teenage Frankenstein and all of that. Then the 60s come along, and you get the transition, the older generation, the new generation, and we're running out of time. I'm not going to go through all of that. I don't know how much you need to know that. Just become familiar with filmmakers and examples of their works. And we don't need to go through all of that. And finally, we end on horizontal control, which is the diversification of the film industry, where you have, it's no longer just making movies, you make everything else to go with it. That is, if you make a movie, you also have the soundtrack album, you gotta have a video game, you gotta have little figures that you can sell, you gotta have all this other stuff to go with your movie in order to make money. That's it. I hope we made it all. Bye. See ya. There. You guys here